Nearly 50 killed in Syria today, and the regime bombards Damascus suburbs and Homs. Traders of Damascus closed their shops in many markets in the capital. And the United Nations decides to keep its observers in Syria, and the Summit of 20 ends with no conclusions. Good evening and welcome to Orient TV English News Bulletin. The Syrian Human Rights Network said that nearly 50 people were killed in Syria today, 10 of them in Damascus and its countryside, with the continuing military operations of the regime. And activists have broadcasted images from Douma for 3 men who were executed by the Assad regime forces, while many neighborhoods in Douma and Harasta have been heavily shelled continuously. In Hamouria, many were wounded when the regime tanks and armored vehicles entered the town's square, whereas in the Qalmoun area, the attacks continued with artillery and rocket launchers in most of its areas. And in the town of Zamalka, at least 2 people were critically wounded by the regime's shooting. In another development, many areas in Damascus suburbs went on a strike in honor of the victims and also believing that this is the key to victory. The towns of Bella and Seda Zainab partook in the strike where shop owners closed their shops, and that was a gesture that shows their condemnation to the massacres and the bloodshed committed by the regime. This comes in a time when the Damascus coordination committees have called for a general strike today and tomorrow, as they distributed flyers and wrote on doors of shops to urge the shop owners to close their shops in solidarity with the cities in Syria. Staying in Damascus, where the regime forces stormed the neighborhood of Jobar this morning, arresting many civilians randomly. And they started shooting at people in the Tadaman neighborhood, wounding many. In the meantime, many anti-Assad demonstrations took place last night in the neighborhoods of Tadaman, Mezze, Medhat Pasha Market, Barze and Jobar in support for the besieged cities, during which demonstrators demanded pushing and punishing al-Assad and his regime. In Damascus suburbs, the regime intensified its military campaigns on many cities and towns, especially Douma, where you see more in the following report.
While the regime intensifies its military presence around Al-Umayyin Square in the capital Damascus that is filled with security barriers, the cities and towns of Damascus suburbs, such as Douma, Zamalka and Bada, were being bombarded by the regime forces, which led to the fall of dozens of victims and injured many others, especially in Douma, that has been besieged and under constant shelling for 5 consecutive days. After he was tortured and suffered several hardships, Yusuf al-Bashash was killed due to a sniper bullet that penetrated his head during the regime's invasion of the city of Saqba. The spreading of military forces was not spared in the towns of Wadi Barada and Deir al-Asafir, which were invaded by a massive number of the regime tanks and artillery. In Al-Damir, activists reported that many tanks moved towards Deir az-Zor, while the cities of Ma'dhamiyya held a successful strike condemning the crimes committed by al-Assad.
With us on the line right now from London, Donatella Riviera, senior advisor to the crisis in Amnesty International, who was recently in Syria. Donatella, thank you for being with us. Hello?
Yes,
can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you very well.
Donatella, as we have been seeing, the humanitarian situation in Syria is deteriorating. But no matter how many videos we watch, things are surely different on ground. Can you tell us about what you have seen firsthand regarding the humanitarian crisis in Syria, please?
Yes, I mean, mostly videos show things from a little distance. I was in cities and in villages and talking to families who had lost their loved ones. Many cases of people who had simply been taken out of their homes by the security forces and summarily executed either outside their homes or else the families found the bodies somewhere in the outskirts of the town or the village. As well, people who had been detained and the families had no idea where their relatives were. And in those cases, the families are very wary of giving publicity to the case. So in most cases, for all those disappeared people, because they are disappeared, that there is no news as to where they may be held, we don't hear about it from outside because the families are far too scared to talk about it. The detainees who had been badly tortured in detention, again, they very rarely speak publicly. So again, it's something that from the outside we don't know. We know, but we don't see it. We don't hear about it in any details. Again, the massive scale of the houses that were burned on purpose by soldiers before the soldiers left. Again, one thing is hearing about the houses have been burned or seeing a video of a burned house, but we're talking in some cases hundreds of houses, so really on a massive scale. And last but not least, when I was in Aleppo, I was observing that several demonstrations in the center of town, and there again, on every occasion, the security forces and the paramilitary militia, the Shabiha, were opening fire on unarmed protesters every single day. And again, it feels obviously quite different being there and seeing it than.
It seems, Donatella, that the situation is really becoming worse. Are there any international steps that are being taken at the moment to alleviate the Syrian people's suffering?
The situation is becoming worse, and indeed the situation, insofar as I can tell, has got worse just in the last couple of weeks since I left Syria. The situation is also becoming worse because there is intensified fighting. The rebels have apparently received more weapons. That means that they are fighting more, and when there is more fighting, the civilians are more likely to get trapped. So there is straightforward human rights violations that are being committed by the Syrian regime. That's been going on for many months. And then there is the risk to the civilian population simply as a result of the increased fighting. Now, what is the international community doing about it? The international community is, spectacularly failed in its responsibility to do anything about it until now. The only initiative that was going, which was the observer mission, as you know, that has now been put on hold. In any case, the mandate of that particular mission is not suitable because, we had a mission that was there to supervise a ceasefire, but there was no ceasefire because neither parties wanted a ceasefire or agreed to ceasefire. So they had no ceasefire to monitor. What is needed is a proper observation mission, a mission with a mandate to investigate. So that those who are responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity begin to get the message.
Thank you, Donatella, for being with us. That was Donatella, an advisor from Amnesty, who was just updating us about the humanitarian situation in the Syrian cities. Moving to Homs, where at least 2 people were killed today, while the neighborhood of Sultaniya was shelled with more than 20 rockets. In the city of Restan in Homs, many were killed and injured due to the continuous bombing with artillery and helicopter gunships amid the tight siege. And the regime also renewed the shelling of Palmyra and the Hisn Castle, which are both very important archaeological sites in Syria. The town of Talbisa wasn't spared either. The regime shelled its neighborhoods with heavy artillery, and activists broadcasted images that show the smoke rising from the city that has been under constant bombardment for 14 days. And in spite of all the violence, the residents all over Homs marched in anti-Assad rallies, confirming their demands of ousting the regime for peace to prevail. Coming up later in the bulletin, the city of Azaz is a role model for other towns in Syria. Welcome back. You are watching Orient TV English News Bulletin. In Daraa, 4 victims were killed. 2 of them were tortured to death, while the city of Dal witnessed heavy shelling from helicopters while explosions rocked the city. In Khirbat Ghazale, several victims were wounded and several neighborhoods were bombed, including Al-Mansaf and Al-Misija in Lajat. Daraa also witnessed a general strike that paralyzed the city, while demonstrations took place in the morning in several towns in support of the affected cities. Four victims died in Latakia today, according to the Syrian Human Rights Network, while artillery bombing continued on Kansaba and Salma. And according to activists, the missiles were launched from a camp located on the outskirts of the city in Latakia, while the regime forces launched an arrest campaign in the neighborhoods of Sijin after a demonstration that came out calling for the overthrow of the regime. In Hama, 4 victims died and several were wounded in the town of Al-Latamina, while shelling continued on the town of Al-Mistriha, while a family was targeted in the neighborhood of Mashal Arba'in with a mortar shell that fell on their house, and several civilians were wounded due to the continued shelling on the town of Karnaz. And missile strikes also targeted the villages Al-Ghab, Qabr Fadda, Al-Huwaiz, Al-Ramla in Al-Ghab plain. Hama and its countryside are still witnessing a fierce military campaign by the regime forces in various cities and towns. And in Deir ez-Zor, helicopters bombed the city of Al-Mayadin, while explosions rocked the neighborhoods of Al-Qusur, followed by heavy gunfire, while shooting was heard in the neighborhood of Ajbele. Meanwhile, activists witnessed the movement of tanks and in Palmyra to the Deir ez-Zor, while demonstrations continued in Al-Khrita, Al-Buwail, Al-Hamidiyya, supporting affected cities and calling for arming the Freedom Syrian Army. Hama and its countryside are still witnessing a fierce military campaign by the regime forces in various cities and towns. More we will see in the following report.
A rocket-propelled grenade fell on the houses in Al-Madiq Castle area, which witnessed indiscriminate shelling by the Syrian regime army. The shelling targeted residential areas and led to the demolition of several houses and the fall of many victims, as in the city of Latamina. While the rest of the neighborhoods in the province of Hama were not better off, as the regime forces stormed and bombed the neighborhoods of Janub al-Mal'ab and Masha' al-Arba'in. And explosions rocked the neighborhoods of Al-Karama, and shooting was heard in the neighborhood of Al-Hadir. While the regime forces continued to send military reinforcements containing different types of tanks and vehicles, the citizens of Hama became accustomed with these scenes of destruction and devastation after the regime raided the cities and the towns. But the Syrians still respond to the regime's brutality in their own way.
In Aleppo and its suburbs, the bombing continued on several areas as the regime continued its shelling of the city of Al-Atarib. This comes as the regime forces were heavily shooting at demonstrators. Meanwhile, in the city, the regime and guerrilla forces invaded Al-Salah neighborhood and randomly shot at demonstrators in Al-Hamdaniya neighborhood. Furthermore, the regime forces started dispersing a protest in a Sukkariya neighborhood by shooting at demonstrators. Sham News Network reported that several were killed and wounded during the bombing that targeted the villages of Al Zawiya Mountain in addition to bombing the village of Marsh Marine. This coincided with the flight of aircraft and heavy fire from the army barriers. Military operations did not stop citizens in Kafrawid and Has and many other cities and towns in Idlib suburbs from going out in demonstrations supporting the affected cities and condemning the silence towards the massacres. Coming up after the break, the city of Azaz is a role model to other cities and towns in Syria. The King of Jordan, King Abdullah II, warned of catastrophic consequences that might be caused due to the continued bloodshed in Syria, calling for a political solution to preserve the unity of the people and territory of Syria through a political process that responds to the aspirations of the Syrian people to reform. The Jordanian king expressed in an interview at the end of his visit to Britain that he believes that the initiative of the UN Arab envoy Kofi Annan is still best placed to develop a comprehensive solution, pointing out that the situation was open to all possibilities and that the window of the solution and the end of the crisis are shrinking. He added that everyone should pay attention to the seriousness of the developments and the slide towards a civil war. The city of Azaz has become a role model to other countries as the regime has yet to take control over it. We will see more about Azaz in Orient exclusive report.
History will one day talk about the city that lasted against the violence and terrorism till its last stone. In Syria, the towns and cities all over the country have a unique story of their own about their own way of fighting against the regime's criminal ways in the revolution. Orient News was on its way to Azaz, one of the most important border crosses in Aleppo suburbs. But to Azaz is another story of resistance and patience. The town where the citizens suffered torture and violence, yet still remained fighting for its goals to achieve freedom in the fight against tyranny. In every corner of the town is a story of revolution. This scene shows that the military planes once crossed over this area, a proof of the monstrous ways of the regime. In this town as well, the Syrian troops were occupying the entire place just months ago, where they tortured the citizens and arrested them to no apparent return. But that changed now. The citizens of Azaz left the town after the military planes of the regime randomly and monstrously bombed the city. The citizens promised to come back, but for now the city is a central place for the Syrian Freedom Army, who is still fighting against the regime that is trying to occupy the city. The city has become a base and crucial camp to the Syrian Freedom Army, where the Syrian troops train on using weapons to retaliate to the regime's bombardment with nothing but basic weaponry and patience that, according to them, will lead them to victory soon. This is Azaz, the city that has now become a role model next to Haytan, Andan, Tar Rifat and other towns. Azaz has now become a city that the world will remember in the future.
U.S. President Barack Obama said that Russia and China have remained outside any plans to remove the head of the Syrian regime from power. But they both recognize the risk of a civil war in the country. Obama said that al-Assad lost his legitimacy and cannot be staying in power no matter what happened in Syria. U.S. President told reporters at the conclusion of the Group of 20 summit in Mexico that Russia and China believe that Syria should have the mechanism to stop the violence and the creation of a legitimate government.
This will also give us an opportunity to discuss.
The United Nations decided to maintain the mission of international observers in Syria. This comes after the failure of Barack Obama to convince the Russian and Chinese counterparts to join the plan for the removal of al-Assad from power in Syria.
President Barack Obama was looking forward to the opportunity to discuss the Syrian crisis and get Russia and China to support the removal of al-Assad from power in Syria.
This will also give us an opportunity to discuss the situation in Syria and to arrive at a cooperative approach that can end the bloodshed there.
Yet, his meeting with the Chinese President Hu Jintao and the Russian President Vladimir Putin in the G20 in Mexico made a little headway. Obama pointed out that it is impossible to imagine any solution in Syria if al-Assad stayed in power. From his side, the British Prime Minister David Cameron said that the Russian President Vladimir Putin has made it clear that he does not want President al-Assad to remain in power.
But it is welcome that President Putin has been explicit he is not locked into Assad remaining in charge in Syria. What we need next is an agreement on a transitional leadership which can move Syria towards a democratic future.
But the Russian President Vladimir Putin has contradicted the previous statement of David Cameron, asserting that the Syrian people should be left to decide who rules their country. And despite the announcement by the British Foreign Secretary William Hague that the military intervention in Syria is still on the table because of the deteriorating situation, according to some analysts, the major powers are not able to reach a solution with the unchanging Russian-Chinese position regarding the Syrian crisis. And returning to the starting point that came from the international efforts, in New York, the United Nations decided to maintain the mission of the international observers in Syria. UN peacekeeping chief Hervé Latsous told reporters that it's crucial to stick with the plan because there's no other plan, nor other game in town, no plan B. While the chief UN monitor for Syria said that his military observers were repeatedly targeted by hostile crowds and gunfire at close range last week before his decision to suspend the operations.
An objective by and in itself. The discussion is about how should we change it, if we'll change it, how should we go forward best to serve the aspirations of the Syrian people who deserve it. The current violence level in Syria is for me a disrespect first and foremost to the Syrian people. Thank you.
And before we end our bulletin, here's a reminder of today's main stories. Nearly 50 killed in Syria today, and the regime bombards Damascus suburbs and Homs. Traders in Damascus closed their shops in many markets in the capital.
20/6/2012.
Many diplomatic.
And the United Nations decides to keep its observers in Syria, and the summit of 20 ends with no conclusions. With this, we end our news bulletin from Orient TV. You can join us tomorrow at the same time for the latest updates on the Syrian revolution. Thank you for watching and goodbye.